So as Karen mentioned, my background is uh, a, uh, a mishmash of academic appointments and industrial research. So I got my doctorate about 40 years ago, something like that, and I've worked in a number of places around the world. Some of these are in Silicon Valley, UC Princeton, University of Edinburgh, and so on. Uh, my Most of my professional career has been focused on the nature of consciousness and especially non-local aspects of consciousness. And people may not know it very well, but virtually everybody in the world is interested in these things. So I've been invited to give talks to a number of US intelligence and military organizations, some of which are shown there, and to most of the Ivy League schools and Cambridge and industrial places. The AAAS in the United States is the biggest scientific organization, and the British Association has a similar version. I've lost track of how many TV networks and shows that I've done, many around the world. About a month ago, a big show on CBS News in the United States, and also for the governments in Australia and Malaysia. So from a mainstream perspective, you'd sometimes be surprised that academia, government around the world are very interested in things that we would call psychic, but that's because people have these experiences, including in these places, and that's why I'm invited to give talks. So given that I have a scientific and engineering background, why would a scientist write a book about magic? This is one of the first questions I often get when I do an interview. And why would the book be endorsed by 2 Nobel laureates and by a former director at the National Science Foundation in the United States, major award winners from the National Institutes of Health, the National Academy of Sciences, president of the American Statistical Association, and many others in the academic world? Why are they endorsing a book on magic? And the answer is very simple, because we're talking about extremely common human experiences. So we did a survey recently among psychic enthusiasts, the general population, and scientists and engineers, and simply asked them, out of 25 different kinds of experiences that could be called psychic, things like clairvoyance and precognition and so on, how many of you have had at least one of those experiences personally? So not surprisingly, psychic enthusiasts said 99% said, yeah, they had at least one, and on average, 13 of 25 experiences. The general population, this is in the United States, 94%, at an average of 7.7 out of 25. And we were surprised that scientists and engineers said 93%. So this really is a common domain of being human. We're so a little surprised, not only that so many scientists and engineers endorsed at least one psychic experience, but actually more than the general population. So these are important because they're experiences that force us to reconsider scientific assumptions about the nature of reality. That's why it becomes interesting from a scientific perspective, and probably more than that, it's important to understand what is wrong about the prevailing scientific viewpoint. So Karen kindly mentioned that I have a new book out, and at least in Amazon in the US, it's doing quite well, and the same Amazon in the UK and Canada and Australia, it's doing equally well. So people seem to like it. I'm not talking about fictional magic. There are many forms of fictional magic, including that kind of magic. I'm not talking about fake magic either. To illustrate fake magic, I'll do a little magic trick here. So pick one of the 4 suits. I want you to concentrate on the suit, and now find a card here that has the suit that you picked. And now I want you to intently focus on that card, because it's going to telepathically tell me yesterday which card you are selecting now. And so now you'll see I have removed your card. So I do this for audiences, and of course I say, by a show of hands, how many people had your card disappear? And of course 100% people say yes. Yeah, so that's a trick. But I'm interested in real magic. So real magic is referring to the esoteric legends, both Eastern and Western esoterica. And it consists of 3 practices. There's divination, which is the stereotype is a crystal ball, but tarot cards and many other methods are used. There's force of will, which is impressing your intention to manipulate reality itself. And theurgy, which is what your organization is interested in, communication with and interaction with spirits of various kinds. So these, if you go all the way back to shamanism, these are the 3 classes of practices that are real magic. So as I said, about a month ago, I was interviewed by a news show on one of our big TV networks. And the interviewer said, what is ESP? She means, of course, extrasensory perception. So I told her, and then she said, but Sean Carroll, who's a physicist at Caltech, says that ESP is impossible. And of course, this is a journalist, and journalists like to poke the people to see how they're going to respond. So I said, well, at least from an experimental evidence point of view, it's very clear that ESP does exist. So then why doesn't Sean Carroll know this? Well, this is a very good starting point. Why is it that people who are spokespersons for mainstream science either don't know the evidence or they don't accept the evidence? Why is that? And the answer has to do with your worldview. It's about scientific worldview. So Sean Carroll fits into materialist worldview, which says that everything is made out of matter, including the brain. The brain is equivalent to the mind. The brain doesn't transcend space-time, so extrasensory perception is impossible. That's a completely logical position if you start from that initial assumption, which is materialism. Some people might think that's an idea of a joke. But that's the way that we are taught in science about how reality works and what it looks like. So the question underneath it is, well, what is the nature of the evidence? And I'm just going to go through a couple of examples here to show how we study the non-local nature of reality and magical practices. So does intention actually influence the world, as force of will would suggest? And does belief modulate that ability? And the reason why I study that question is because in the magical lore, that's one of the key elements that modulates whether magic is working or not. It's your belief. So we did this in the context of the tea ceremony in China. So this is members of a Buddhist temple in Taiwan. My collaborators there in the middle. And we asked the 3 Buddhist monks in charge of the temple to take a pot of oolong tea, separate it into 2 equal batches, to bless one of the pots so that anybody who drank that tea would feel greater vigor, less fatigue, and in general their mood would be elevated. And then they had the control tea, which is the same tea, but it wasn't blessed. We put the tea into little bottles. We gave it to 100 people. And each of the people were told that over the course of a week to record their mood at the end of the day. They're using a standardized mood scale to do this. So the 3 middle days of the week, they were told at 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. to drink a little bottle of tea that we gave them. This was under double-blind conditions, so they did not know if they were drinking blessed tea or not blessed tea. So it's a standard clinical, randomized clinical design. So the placebo control condition is this, that everyone believed that the tea that they were drinking was blessed or treated. Some of them actually did get the treated tea and some did not. So this is holding stable people's belief about what they were getting. So everyone thought they were getting the treated tea. And this shows then the difference. So people getting the treated or the blessed tea actually had improved mood as compared to people getting the untreated tea. And so after the 3 days of drinking tea and days 3, 4, and 5, it's a statistically significant difference. So that shows that even under placebo control, that the blessing did something because people reported better mood. And I'm skipping over how we matched people so that they were the same personality, same age and gender and all that. So the two groups were matched as closely as we could manage, and they still showed a significant difference. So the blessing worked. There's the other condition, which is nocebo. This is the condition where no one believed that the tea that they were drinking was blessed. Some did get the blessed tea and some did not. And in this case, you can see that there's no difference. So this is a way of illustrating then that their belief about what they were drinking strongly modulated whether or not the blessing worked. And you can see that contrast here most clearly. That's an extremely significant difference statistically. So this says everyone was drinking the treated or the blessed tea, but some believe that they were and some believe that they weren't. And that's where you see this big difference. So belief does modulate intentional effects, just like it says in the magical lore. Another experiment we did to follow it up was, since we had done several experiments looking at mood as a modulator, we wanted to see if there was an objective difference with a blessing. So we used this little plant called Arabidopsis thaliana, which is like a little, I think it's called mouse crest ear or something like that, mouse ear cress. It's a mustard plant. So again, we had the Buddhist monks treat some water and have identical water that was not treated. And then we took the seeds, the Arabidopsis seeds, and then prepared in a standardized way. Some of them got the water medium A, and some got water medium B. One was treated and one was not treated under double-blind conditions. And then they were grown in the usual way. And what we're interested in is this thing here called hypocotyl. The hypocotyl is from the top of the roots to the bottom of the first leaves. And it's a standardized way of measuring how healthy the plant is. So the shorter and fatter the hypocotyl, the better the plant is doing. So if you get a long, skinny hypocotyl, it's not behaving very well. So the reason why we chose this plant is because it has a protein in it that responds to blue light. In fact, all plants have the same protein. It's called cryptochrome. And it's the plant or it's the protein in flowers that causes the flower to track the sun. And it's the same protein that causes certain plants to open when the sun comes up. So they're responding to blue light. But that protein is also interesting because it appears to be sensitive down to the quantum level. It is behaving as a quantum system. So we thought, well, that might be a very interesting protein to look at because maybe it's more sensitive to human observation than otherwise, or to this blessed tea. So that's why we use that plant. This shows the results of 4 repeated experiments that we did, and it's the hypocotyl we're looking at. So in each case, the treated or the blessed water produced a smaller hypocotyl length, which is what we were interested in. It meant that the plants are healthier. So in this then is simply a composite of the whole thing, that the seeds or the plants grown with blessed water did very significantly better than the ones that got the control water. The probability is 10 to the minus 14th, so we have high confidence that this was a real effect. I trust him. He has a science background. So in my previous books and a little bit in my current book, I talk about the nature of the evidence. But I also just wanted to mention this, that in 2016, the president of the American Statistical Association gave her presidential address to an audience of 6,000 statisticians around the world. And among what she said in an hour-long talk was somewhat unexpected. She started talking about her work for the US government in analyzing the remote viewing data. And so she said this in her talk: the data in support of precognition and possibly other related phenomena are quite strong statistically and would be widely accepted if they pertain to something more mundane. So this is important because statistics is the discipline within science that specializes in analyzing data. And so when skeptics say, like Sean Carroll says, ESP is impossible, I say, go talk to Jessica, because she's the spokesperson of statistics, and not only in the United States, but around the world. And after having analyzed the data, ESP does exist. So generally, when we find very strong statements like this is impossible, it means that they actually don't know what they're talking about. They don't know the data. You also find, this is very interesting too, this came out just a couple of days ago in American Psychologist. American Psychologist is the flagship journal of the American Psychological Association. It is absolutely dead center mainstream in academic psychology, and they have a major article in American Psychologist on the experimental evidence for parapsychological phenomena, and the conclusion is, just as Jessica Utt said, that the evidence is comparable to that for established phenomena in psychology and other disciplines. So this is not exactly a breakthrough, but to appear, this kind of article to appear in this journal will make a lot of people have at least one eyebrow raised. So I did a miniature version of what I just said to the correspondent, and she said, okay, maybe there's some evidence, but how does it work? And this is then really the core. This is the reason why I wrote a book about magic, to address this issue. How does it work? If I have to explain the meaning of existence, then it isn't funny. Well, that's one approach. And basically, this is why, from a mainstream perspective, a materialistic perspective, magic cannot work. And it's because we assume that the bottom nature of reality is physics. And from physics emerges chemistry, and from that biology, and that psychology, and somehow magically consciousness appears near the top of this pyramid. From this perspective, philosophers and some scientists have said that we're basically zombies. We're machines made out of meat. There's actually, consciousness is the last part of a long series of purely mechanical and materialistic events, so it doesn't have any meaning. So we're zombies. And so from that perspective, magic is denied. You can't have magic, it doesn't work. And so it is also not reasonable to throw away existing science. It works too well. We wouldn't be able to do this webinar if materialism wasn't true. So we have a problem. And the problem is, we also know that ESP exists, so we're missing something. So what are we missing? Well, we're dealing with blinders. So this is an advertisement from the 1930s where the woman had blinders because she just didn't like new ideas. And the new idea in this advertisement was a refrigerator. So she didn't like the idea of having a refrigerator because of this stereotype of what she didn't want to have. And blinders is actually what we're talking about when you adopt a worldview. So the worldview within science is, I don't know how to think about that. Another way of illustrating this is I could give a talk about various kinds of ducks found around the world. And then we'll talk about this duck for a while. So keep that duck in mind. Meanwhile, we'll go and do something else, and we'll say, are the dark blue lines in this display, are they straight? Well, they certainly don't look straight, but like most visual illusions, I'll put in a bunch of parallel lines, and sure enough, they're really straight. So this is your brain tricking you to see something which is not the way it actually is. And to give another example, and visual illusions tell us that we don't actually perceive the world as it is. We perceive it the way we've been trained to see. We construct a perception of reality. So when you look at this, it looks like there's some green bars and pink bars and blue bars. And so I'll just take away the pink bars, and you'll see that there is no green and blue, it's just all green. So this is a very well-known color illusion. And now I'll slowly bring back the color. Let's bring it back here. And then you'll see now we start having green and blue again. So this is a color visual illusion that has to do with the way that your retina works. Once again, illustrating that what we see is not necessarily what's out there. So now we're going to have a talk about rabbits. And after an hour talking about these rabbits, we'll talk about this rabbit. But of course, by now you've already recognized that that is the same as the duck. And so this ambiguous figure is a way of, again, illustrating that slight changes in simply the priming of what we're going to talk about can determine what you see. So our scientific worldview determines what we see. So what are we missing? And where should we look for clues about what we're missing? So one clue is you look at what Isaac Newton did. So Newton is considered one of the first physicists, but he, of course, is known for actually writing much more about alchemy than about science. So we looked even further back into shamanism, and maybe those people were onto something interesting. So here I'm talking about the esoteric traditions, everything from Hermeticism and Neoplatonism, Kabbalah, alchemy, Gnosticism, the mystery schools of Egypt, of Greece, and now the new mystery schools, the Jedi mystery school, which started in the UK. We have the Knights Templar, we have the Freemasons, the Rosicrucians, Theosophy, Christian Science, Gurdjieff, up through Aleister Crowley and Peter Carroll, who were part of the magical revival. We have evidence that Scientology began because L. Ron Hubbard was a good friend of Aleister Crowley. There are plenty of books out there about neo-paganism, Wicca, which is a relatively new invention, witchcraft in the modern sense. All of these are basically overlaps. There's of the esoteric lore and neo-paganism, Wicca is somewhere in the middle. There's thousands of grimoires or books of spells out there. Sorcery for beginners. These are all now a relatively, not new, but a rising re-interest in these ancient ideas. You see this in books around the world. So in the modern era, and I mean from that about the 1920s, many books are talking about what affirmations, essentially, and channeling. And these are some of the most popular books in history, billions of dollars, hundreds of millions of copies of these books have been sold. You see it all the way up into medicine. So mind over medicine is a way that these ancient esoteric ideas have basically become part of popular culture. So what I did was I would look through this entire history, roughly 10,000 years, maybe a little bit longer, to look for a synthesis about what does that entire domain of knowledge tell us that could provide a clue as to how can we understand that materialism works, but ESP works too. And so the simple way of thinking of it is the perennial philosophy. And Aldous Huxley's book is a good way of summarizing it, and basically it comes down to these three words: consciousness is fundamental. So the subtitle of my book is The Secret Power of the Universe. The secret power is consciousness. And all we do then is take our original idea of materialism, and we are now talking about the philosophy of idealism, which is doing this. It's simply putting consciousness below physics. We create a new assumption about what is the underlying basis of reality. And with this model, consciousness is before space-time. It's before physics, before space-time, and it's before the physical world. And just as in physics, you have electrons that emerge into chemistry, and in chemistry, you have molecules that emerge into biology, and biology have proteins that emerge into psychology, and so on. Now we can say that consciousness or awareness emerges into physics. So aspects of physics are aware. And likewise, it emerges into chemistry. So aspects of chemistry are aware. And importantly, the consciousness we're talking about is part of the fabric of reality before physics, in which case all of us, by virtue of having consciousness, are aware before space and time. That's why we can perceive through space and time, because it's before physics. So from this perspective, magic is not only accepted, it's you can predict that it must exist. So again, from an idealist point of view, mind is the basis of everything, including matter. From a materialist perspective, it's exactly the opposite. Matter is the basis of everything, including mind. So from all this, space-time and mind all emerge from consciousness. So divination works because the mind can know everything. It can perceive through space and time. Force of will works because mind or consciousness manipulates reality. Reality emerges, physical reality emerges from mind. And theurgy works because physical embodiment is just one form in which consciousness can take. So the physical body is a very adept form, a very tuned way that consciousness can exist, but it can exist in many other forms as well. So here's channeling on the cheap. My name is Eunice. I have lived many past lives, most of them in Trenton, New Jersey. So are we to take magic seriously? Well, magical thinking is everywhere, all the time. Every time somebody does a superstitious act like this, that is part of magic. Prayer is magic. People are very intently doing something in their mind with intention. That's force of will magic. We find it everywhere in the world. We find here is Hindus praying for Trump. We have the Pope praying for something. In the United States, we have the commemorative presidential prayer journal for people who want to pray for Donald Trump. And we have magicians who had a mass binding spell against Trump. So we have a lot of prayer wars going on. The Catholic ceremony of the Eucharist is very explicitly a magical practice. So religion believes in magic. All religions believe in magic, but they strictly ban it. So you're allowed to do magic only if you are ordained, and only certain kinds of magic. Otherwise, it's very strictly banned, called heretical or demonic. And this, of course, led to the horrors of the Inquisition and witch burning and all that. On the other hand, science denies that magic can exist. We've already seen that this occurs because of the worldview that science holds, because of the materialistic worldview. So you do get, because people are interested in magic, you get books like this, The Science of Harry Potter, which is saying, it's a book about technology that basically says that if somebody could fly on a broomstick, here's how we could do it using technology. So it's not really about magic, it's about technology. And then you have militant atheists like Richard Dawkins, who doesn't believe in anything. So his use of the term magic is really more about awe. It's about the scientific amazement about nature of reality. Even J.K. Rowling was basically forced to say that she did not believe in the occult because she was being attacked by religious people for polluting the minds of our youth. So from the academic perspective, magic is false. It doesn't work. From a religious perspective, magic is real, but it's dangerous, so stay away. And from people who work in the magical traditions, the neo-pagans, the Wiccans, and so on, they agree magic is real, but it's not something that science can test. So much for magic, all gone, except for a small problem. And the problem is that the claims of magic have been tested in science. I already mentioned why we already know that that is true. The divination, power of will, theurgy have been studied for at least 150 years, and we know that these practices are talking about real things. So my first book, this is over 20 years ago already, was talking about how science studies these phenomena, how we know that they're real. The second book was talking about why what we know does not violate what we know about physics. The third book was about an Eastern esoteric practice, primarily yoga, which leads to siddhis, special powers, psychic powers. And my latest book now is talking about the Western esoteric traditions. And as a result of going through this exercise, basically what I'm saying is that the direction that these are pointing is the future of science. And so I can show and hear why I believe that. If you look at books by leading scientists in a number of different disciplines, this one happens to be in physics, talking about information as the nature of reality. Here's another quantum physicist talking about the universe as quantum information, mathematician talking about mathematics as the nature of reality, This is a neuroscientist talking about consciousness as the fundamental of reality. These are all thought leaders in science today. So the leading edge of science is already talking about the physical world is not exactly physical the way we thought it was. It's made out of information. It's made out of consciousness or mathematics. This just came out a couple days ago. Oh, no, this is an earlier one. This came out in 2016. The world's smartest physicist thinks science can't crack consciousness. You see this more and more in Scientific American is a very mainstream scientific magazine where people who are thinking about consciousness are beginning to agree that it cannot come out of a materialistic viewpoint. That is opening people's minds to the possibility of idealism. This one just came out a few days ago. Coming to grips with the implications of quantum mechanics, the question is no longer whether quantum theory is correct, but what it means, and the important role is that seems to be a primary role for mind in nature. This is a repeated theme you see again and again. This is from Nature, top scientific journal. Again, basically saying the universe is entirely mental. This is idealism. Consciousness is fundamental. You see it again. Everything from spoons to stones are conscious is gaining academic credibility. This came out earlier this year. Here in Nature Physics, the key point is that our experiment confirms Bohr's view that it does not make sense to ascribe the wave or particle behavior to a massive particle before measurement takes place. And by measurement, they're talking about observation. Closer you look, the more the materialist position in physics appears to rest on shaky metaphysical ground. Physics is beginning to put the perceiving subject back into physics. Again in Nature, challenging local realism with human choices. It's a very complicated experiment, but the bottom line was that human observation seems to be one of the reasons why we look around and see a world around us. Consciousness is somehow responsible for the emergence of the physical world. We're talking here about the mind-body problem. Get up? No. I have that same argument quite a bit. So philosophers have been dealing with this problem for a very long time. And what science is moving towards is something like Alice in Wonderland, who pulls back the curtain and sees the matrix, that the reality is ultimately numbers, symbols, information, all of which have to do with consciousness. So why is it important to have a worldview? She asks. And my response is that your worldview, if you haven't seen the movie Doctor Strange, you should see it because it is a very nice illustration of somebody who absolutely was dead center materialist and required this kind of demonstration to convince him that there was something more than material. So this is the ancient one who's pushing him out into his astral body. That's what convinced him. And for some people, you require that level of convincing to get it. So from a scientific viewpoint, we are machines made of meat. From other viewpoints, maybe we're something else. We clearly are machines made of meat, but maybe there's something more than machines made of meat. And the reason why it's important to know which one is correct is because the machines made of meat give rise to science fiction like the Terminator series. We're just mechanical objects. The universe is pointless. There's no meaning in anything. And this, of course, leads to nihilism, which is a very depressing way to live. Maybe there really is something more going on, something more interesting. Certainly the evidence from psychic phenomena, from mysticism, suggests that there is something else going on. Arthur C. Clarke said it in a nice way, any sufficiently advanced science is indistinguishable from magic. He actually used the word technology. I'm using the word science, but it's the same thing. So we're doing a combination of magic, who is the fairest one of all, and science, and state your sources. This is, I think, the direction that will be most fruitful in the future.